Well, good morning, everyone. I announced last week that I wanted to devote this morning to the Vineyard Community Centre. Before we do, let's just pray, and I'd like to pray. Father, I want to say that I want to ask that you would bless my words, that you would speak to people, that your kingdom purposes would be furthered by what I have to say this morning. In Jesus' name, Amen. A little while ago, Peter Flower reminded me that our church had not always been supportive of the Vineyard Project, as it was called then, which was run in our basement by Richmond and Barnes Mind. We were pretty unhappy, to be honest, about the drinking on the street outside, the considerable amount of antisocial behaviour, the general inconvenience that it brought. The then priest at the church next door used to literally kick visitors off his porch. Neighbours were always complaining. At one time we were praying it out. But Peter reminded me just a few weeks ago that the Lord had spoken to us all and reminded us of the Good Samaritan. And so we began to pray for the people and the community that was there. Now, about 16 years ago, something called Jesus Ministry came to London out of Destiny City Church, which is in Tacoma on the northwest coast of America. And they had a large population of impoverished white multi-ethnic people, and one of their satellite churches, now called Freedom River Outreach, was comprised almost entirely of homeless people, addicts, prostitutes, who'd been saved and very much set free. And it was around the time of the change of heart that we had as a church, concerning our own basement, that I decided to visit Freedom River and its pastor John Graziano and his wife Kathy, and they arranged for me to stay at a safe house for men. But I arrived just after the house father had a heart attack, and so as he went off to hospital, I was asked to look after the home and its 5 new occupants. It was what's called a pin-down ministry, very limited freedom of movement. The house had 3 American Japanese drug dealers in it and 2 other formerly very unsavoury characters, all of whom now profess Christ, but they were as raw as a hen in a hen house, raw as a hen's eggs in a hen house. God was with me. Fortunately, I survived a few narrow squeaks, and after I left, I heard that all 5 were wonderfully baptised. But in that week, I experienced a ministry firmly grounded in the social gospel of supporting the needs of hundreds of very poor people in their precinct, many of whom lived in shacks, RVs, vans beneath the freeways. But the church also offered a very spirit-filled prayer and prophetic healing ministry to everyone who visited, and they had a large warehouse for the support that they offered. In addition, while they opened to meet the public need, they had a room for intercessory prayer on a mezzanine above the main premises. And sometimes 2 or 3 people took turns in praying for an hour, half an hour, specifically for the ministry that was going on below. I well remember the day I left as I received words of prayer, prophecy, in a room of about a dozen people, 2 of whom had been young working prostitutes, not much more than 2 weeks before. And now they were completely beautifully clean, wonderfully set free in mind, body and spirit. It was not so long after that I went there that in 2011 Mind suddenly vacated our basement, and we had the opportunity to take back what was that portion of our premises. The Vineyard Project had been such a significant part of the community for years that our local MP, the police, the borough deans, range of interested parties called a meeting in a cafe on Richmond Green, and we spent half an hour debating, or they spent half an hour debating what should be done to maintain the work of the project in our basement. And eventually I managed to stick up my hand to say that actually it was our building, and it was entirely up to us to decide what to do with it. In fact, everyone had completely overlooked that, so the room fell silent. Someone eventually said, to me, well, what are you going to do with it? And at that point I had no idea what we were supposed to do or what means we had to do, whatever it was we were supposed to do. But I said, we will carry on. And everyone seemed very happy and relieved, and the meeting duly ended, leaving me with the problem. What are we going to do? We prayed. I drew a diagram. I remember feeling inspired to draw a diagram of two intersecting circles and a third separate circle. We formed a steering group with people from other churches, and this one, I didn't think that we should just continue with only a drop-in for the homeless, and so the first circle on my diagram represented that ministry, but just in the mornings, and the second one was an afternoon cafe for social inclusion, a haven for the lonely, the marginalised, and so on, but perhaps not necessarily in crisis. And 6 months later, in fact, the cafe became the host of the first food bank for the borough. The intersection of those two circles on the diagram, the transition between the homeless services and the afternoon cafe, was perhaps the most important. It was a half hour when we would close, when we would pray together, establish perhaps something almost of a monastic routine in the midst of busyness, a time to regather with Jesus and to pray. The separate circle, which represented the evenings, was to be a youth and music ministry for young people. This had long been a feature of the basement from the time of the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, the who were doing their thing in Richmond. And that music venue became the basement door, part of our charity, but then subsequently a completely separate charity now in different venues around the borough. We almost immediately, as we opened, began to discover God's favour. Desiree Shepherd was very instrumental in shaping the life, the Christian culture, and without Peter Flower we couldn't have managed our administration. And now, 9 years on from that official opening, we have grown enormously. We operate from 8 buildings across the borough. We employ, I think, 14 full or part-time staff. And prior to lockdown, we had something like 120 volunteers across all our departments. What I want to do this morning is to tell you some of the lessons that I think we've learned, that I think I've learned, and also to take the opportunity of this COVID-enforced change to look towards our future. I think the first thing we learned was that God does eventually answer prayer. We know that, of course, but it's good to be reminded. As a church, we had prayed for the work of our basement for a number of years with seemingly no prospect of any change. And then suddenly change came. So suddenly, in fact, that it took us by surprise when mine vacated. Yet it only took a year from their vacating to formally reopen with a packed basement, invited guests of all kinds, and nearly fully converted premises. I seem to remember the kitchen wasn't quite ready, but we had managed to find about £130,000 to do it, and we had a new charity, we had staff, we had God-given vision, and we had a very strong sense of his favour in so many practical arrangements which helped us to carry on. Throughout this talk, I'm going to ask a number of questions, not necessarily give answers to them. And the first question is this, to you, the church. What are we praying for now? What is it that we want to see in the future that God will bring to pass because we are praying for it now? Secondly, we also learned that as a small church, the vision and the task was far bigger than we could accomplish on our own. We needed to call for partners to join in. That's one of the reasons that some of you are here today, because of the joining of Richmond Borough Church. We also knew, particularly from my experience in founding street pastors in Richmond, that it's much easier to join hands with other Christians to clothe the naked, to feed the hungry, than it is sometimes to agree about doctrine. We can all agree on the ministry to the poor and the oppressed, and that goal is uniquely unifying, a uniquely unifying ministry. Thirdly, we came to realise that people who could lead in this were not necessarily people who had major pastoral roles in the church. Church pastors and elders are often they're just simply too busy. When this church was founded in 1831, it quickly grew to a congregation of 500. It seems impossible now, but there were 500, and that without a minister as well. And when a minister was soon appointed, it became very quickly obvious that someone else was needed to serve the poor, and so a home mission minister was appointed for that. I knew that that was more of my role, and so that's why David's father was invited as a new senior pastor and the church that he looked after, and indeed David follows on in that role. Before I really realised some of this dynamic, one of my biggest disappointments was an opportunity given to establish an annual prayer gathering with the council. After 2 years, the community centre had begun to establish a good reputation. I had an opportunity to speak a couple of times at something called the annual Richmond Partnership Conference in Twickenham Stadium, and it gathers 100 or so of the heads of civic departments in the borough. And after the second occasion, I spoke to the head of the council, then Lord Drew. He was the head of council, and separately spoke to the chief executive, Gillian Norton, at the time, saying that I would really like to establish an annual prayer breakfast for the council. And actually, to my surprise, they were both enthusiastic. In fact, Lord Drew said to me, don't let the idea drop. The great disappointment was that I couldn't get the evangelical church in the borough at all interested. And now I realise that although I would have had to involve church ministers, of course, they were simply too busy looking after their own churches to contemplate anything else. It takes a well-unified local church, churches working together, when ministers work and pray together, in order to do something like that. And it takes pioneers and those who are not caught up looking after church. It was a great disappointment to me, and the opportunity went for the time being with the change of administration. I recently looked up the website of the church I visited in Tacoma, and I also came across other church websites in that city. And what really struck me was how many featured and referred to other churches and other church ministries. If one church had a volunteer group that fixed roofs, it was referred to by other churches. Feeding stations, clothing provision, healing ministries, they were all supported by the collective local church instead of the usual, this is what our church does. Everything that I've been involved in, street pastors, the Easter Passion Play, the Community Centre, the Richmond Food Bank, community chaplains, working with the Met Police, everything, nothing could have been accomplished without the unified mission of the wider church. So the second question that I want to ask, I'm not going to pose an answer to it, is what do we want the church to look like in this borough in 5 years, in 10 years? Is it the greater blessing of unity? Then we must pray for that. It took many years of prayer before we began to enjoy a really good relationship with our Catholic neighbours. And we now enjoy friendship and cooperation with them, and our other neighbours too. We realised that even with the support of other Christians, though, and there are 29 churches in the borough that in some way are involved with the current work of the community centre and the food bank particularly. We also needed people of goodwill who were not necessarily of faith or of other faiths. We needed them to be involved as well. Provided our senior staff, our captains, if you like, our governance, our prayer, was maintained with Christian faith and action, then including many others meant that they could also be part of our mission field, and in fact be our mission field alongside those that we were helping. In fact, sometimes even more so because of the continuity of relationship and the sense of inclusion in family, volunteers, donors, supporters and visitors and so on. When Jeremiah wrote from Jerusalem to all the elders, the priests and the prophets who were in exile, he wrote in the context of people who had given up on Babylon, where they were. The land of captivity they found themselves in was something they just wanted to escape from. and they were encouraging prophetic words and the expectation of soon returning to Jerusalem. You might say they were aliens in this foreign land, just as we are in ours, but they were only interested in going to heaven. Jeremiah chapter 29 verse 4 says, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens, eat their produce, marry and have sons and daughters, find wives for your sons, and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper." And so we learned that the community centre is an incarnational ministry. We're called to dwell and work among those without faith, praying for their blessing, their peace, their prosperity, knowing that the assurance of our future is certain, but dwelling amongst those who are not certain, such that they may be gathered in to that assurance. Just like Jesus came and, of course, dwelt amongst us. We read about it in the first chapter of John's Gospel. So the third question I would pose is, what vision do we have individually and as a church for our community, the community in which we dwell, and for the community in which our children will dwell? Fifthly, we learnt that we had stumbled from the outset on a different model. Most community centres derive most of their income from hiring space to community groups, Pilates, the dance, Italian lesson, the wedding venue and so on. We've never hired our space, but we've concentrated on meeting the needs of those who could never afford the money or the time to belong to what is usually a middle-class leisure time activity. In concentrating on supporting needs, particularly those in crisis, and by not having a reception-based or appointment-based system, but open access to our community, we became accessible to all sections of our community, from multi-billion-dollar businesses, who've supported us in some way, to mental health groups, from wealthy dot-com neighbours living on the hill not far away, to those who are rough sleeping on the street with absolutely nothing. The wider community, I believe, have felt that they can be involved in doing good alongside us. And in joining in with us, they've come to realise that God is in this place. Something that people often say. In fact, I've heard many people say that God is in this place. Because of this, we've been able to model a flow of resource to meet outward need, rather than a flow of resource to meet our need. We receive and we give. Others can join in that outward flow of blessing in every one of our departments. One lady has now cooked over 12,000 cupcakes for us, 70 a week, which we've given freely, no charge, just to bless our cafe visitors. And she has a daughter working in Kew Gardens who passed on several thousand chocolate Easter eggs through our hands to others. Her husband is the retired head of EMI and Universal Records, and he's now involved in the Basement Door, the youth and music charity. We could not begin to list the amount of blessing and the favour that we've received. We've simply acted as a conduit to freely bless our community with support and with prayer. Seventh point I want to make is that we have been influencers in the borough. I believe we really have. Having stumbled on this model, we've been able to influence and develop work in other centres, from Barnes right way through to Hampton. And we've been able to speak to the leaders of the council, our MPs and so on, and demonstrate that you can make things work by giving and finding that you receive in return. We've also been able to speak and to influence business and to gather them into partnerships. I'm always absolutely amazed at some of the opportunities and the goodwill that's been shown to us. I remember the vice president of $100 billion company got straight off the plane from America jet-lagged as he was, tired, and he joined us to an event in the basement. Another global company commissioned their conference bags. Their international conference was going to have conference bags. They commissioned them from our sewing project, and they handed them out at their conference. In fact, we handed them out at the conference in the London Hilton, one of the London Hiltons. They volunteered with us beforehand. They made a film of our work, which became a conference highlight in the midst of representations from the likes of Microsoft, Google, Apple, and delegates told us that the little old vineyard was the highlight of the conference. I'm completely amazed at many things that have happened like that. I found that indirectly, through the work of the centre, I could gather with other Christians regularly. For instance, in the commander's office of one of the Met Police's 3 command and control centres, which overlook Lambeth Palace. It overlooks Lambeth Palace and the House of Parliament. I found that I could also initiate our borough's leg of prayer walk between London's town halls, and the deputy leader of our council opened up the council chambers for us so that we could pray for our council in that chamber along with her. We found God's favour in all kinds of relationships. At some point, which it usually allows us some kind of opportunity for the gospel, opportunities to pray, invitations to speak. We discovered, in effect, the truth of Isaiah 58, verse 5 and onwards. It says, "Is this the kind of fast I've chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it not? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in a sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fast I've chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, here am I." We discovered, I think, another point I want to make, we discovered a social liturgy. Local authorities and the corporate world are usually pretty suspicious of Christians. They think we just want to evangelise or do things just for the benefit of our congregation, or we just want money. It didn't take us too long for the word out there the world out there to begin to trust us, to know that we were more interested in giving than getting, that we could do things quickly and that we could do them well, and that we were perhaps not the two-headed peculiar creatures that they assumed us to be, and that we acknowledged a common grace, that the rain falls on the just and the unjust, which I'm sure you know is a blessing in the Middle East, not the curse that is in the UK. They realised that we seek to bless with generosity and with faith, and so we discovered an authenticity about our work. Our deeds, if you like, matched our words, at least they were perceived to, and I hope they did. So often Christians can seem scrappy, can't they? They can seem ungracious, or on the other hand, they can seem rather cowed and defensive. It's kind of like fight or flight. They can be thought of as hypocritical. Often people out there think the church is hypocritical. But by God's grace, we learned how to talk to people in such a way that they would listen. In our very early days, we helped someone called Ludwig, who had hit very hard times because he was wrongfully imprisoned, and he'd lost everything several years after he was back on his feet, and he was living just behind Mick Jagger's house up on the hill. He discovered a woman and her son of about 6 years old living in the service area amongst the bins. She spoke Russian. She had fled from domestic violence from her partner. They'd lived on a boat, probably illegally, and in fear of her life, she'd made her life behind the refuse bins with a little boy of 6 years old. Ludwig called me early one morning, having discovered her that night, and taken her in. He'd given the boy a bath. He'd refused sex because that's what she thought was necessary to be helped. She'd offered it. And I asked him if he would discreetly take a photo of the boy, as well as saying he must immediately call the police, because he really should have done. But she was very reluctant to do that. And I asked for a photo because that morning at 9 o'clock, I was invited to speak to about 100 employees at the estate agent Savills headquarters here in Richmond. I blew up the photo of the boy who was asleep, clutching a teddy. And the first thing I did when speaking to Savills employees, all young millennials as far as I could see, was to show them that photo and tell them about this family living by the bins in the service area of a property that they would most likely have for sale in their glossy brochures. They had absolutely no idea that such a thing was possible in wealthy Richmond. And although I couldn't freely share the gospel to them at that time, I could have an authentic conversation with many. And as someone once said, where there is an authentic conversation, the gospel is only 2 inches away. The seventh point I want to make is that we're now learning that maintaining long-term vision and faith takes people of faith to steer the helm. We need people of strong Christian faith who are involved in some way, some vital way, to maintain our Christian vision and kingdom priority. At the moment, we have no staff employed from this church in the charity. We do have Christians, of course, and the trustees will always be a majority from this church. But what happens to Christian charities, initially founded with inspiration and vision and grace from God, favour from God, what happens is that as they grow, others get involved, sometimes with lesser vision and faith. And if we're not careful, the anchor which holds us close to Jesus and close to the leading of the Spirit, that anchor can slowly get pulled up and the ship begins to drift away. So my fourth question is, what is the faith and vision of this church so that this doesn't happen? To what is probably the major mission, the major God-given mission field that we have. What is our faith and vision so that this doesn't happen? How will we ensure that what happened to the vision of one of our earlier church ministers doesn't happen to us, that it drifts away from the church? How can we continue with us to be obedient to what God has so graciously restored to us through answered prayer? How can we ensure that it won't slip into striving for the fruit without the root, which will only eventually lead to a barren tree? How can we add the cutting edge of Holy Spirit ministry such that the kind of things I experienced in Tacoma might be present here? One of the big challenges, I think, is that the Tacoma church grew out of those who were being ministered to. The homeless, the addicted, the poor. Whereas the majority of this church are employed, you're occupied, some of you have little contact or little possibility of contact with what goes on in our basement. And so the seeds of separation could easily germinate. But we're determined that won't happen. And so we'll be looking in our leadership and together with you at ways to unify our mission, the mission of the Vineyard Community Centre, with the church. In the meantime, we'd like you to pray with us if you can. There's a regular midday Tuesday Zoom prayer, for instance, so you're going to put it on our church suite. But apart from that, you can also be involved together with your street, your neighbours, and those that you come across. Just after Christmas, a large box of adult sanitary pads came into the centre. We have endless donations of all sorts, probably now approaching 100 tonnes of food in the last year. For instance, no one knew what to do with these sanitary pads, so I thought I would knock on what I thought was the warden's flat, not more than about 50 metres across the road from where I live, where also there are lots of elderly people in sheltered accommodation. I hadn't realised that there was no longer a warden there, as if someone comes once a week on Tuesdays, but no warden, no one looking after them. And instead, a much younger lady answered when I explained that I had these sanitary pads. Could she use them? She just, her mouth dropped. She said, yes. I can take as many as you can possibly give me. She was Russian. Olga was her name, is her name. Well-educated microbiologist whose older husband, Patrick, had gone into hospital at the beginning of the year. But he'd been neglected. Seemingly, he'd had bed sores which were neglected, and this resulted in amputations. And she said she hadn't slept for 7 months, looking after him 24/7. She had no recourse to public funds, and she thought that her husband had been shut away, bedbound, to die. And she felt that it was going to kill her too. I prayed with Olga, as I often do. I obviously left the sanitary pads, which she desperately needed, and I've referred her to our caseworker at the centre to try and establish legal and advocacy help. And she's now receiving weekly deliveries from the food bank. And I also bring fresh food at least 3 times a week, mostly substantial amounts of cakes, pastries, bread and salads and so on. And Olga distributes to the 37 elderly residents, mostly over 90, in her block, which I have no access to. She says that it not only is transforming her, but the residents, mostly older than 90, because she now knocks on their doors. She has a chat with them. They sometimes wait for long periods outside her door until she can come out with stuff. It's stimulating their social contact where otherwise they are completely isolated. They haven't had any vaccinations yet. And in doing good herself, joining with us and us joining with her, Olga's dreadfully stressed mental state is beginning to improve. It's not my assessment, it's her own words. As I visit her outside her door, she tells me that, and I encourage her and I pray for her. And so you may not be able to visit the community centre, but you can knock on a neighbour's door, or you can telephone, and you can see if they're okay. And if they're not, you can at least supply them with food. We have many tons of food in store and clothing. You only need to contact me to make arrangements, and I'll tell you how to do it. And so, therefore, you may, in your own way, be able to connect with the mission of the community centre, which is part of your church. So please pray along with us for the concrete vision of this church, and to make sure that there's a ministry which is God given, so graciously given to us, remains firmly in his hands, together with his church, with this church, and that it may remain effective for the kingdom. I want to finish, I may have gone over time a bit, but I want to finish just by joining us in prayer for that aim and for the elders and for the church as we seek to be envisioned and re-envisioned about the work that God has given us to do, particularly in this rather unusual, constrained time of the COVID pandemic. So, Father, you've heard my words. You know us, Lord, and we seek to serve you. We're so grateful, Lord, for the work that you've given to us, the work of the community centre, and the many hundreds of people, thousands of people that in some way we've reached. We ask, Lord, that we would find a new wind of your Spirit, that we would find a unifying ability that the church and the community centre would work together with other churches, that we would be an incarnational presence to our community, that would be instruments of change, of blessing, that we would see your kingdom grow, that, Lord, all that we do would prosper at your hand, because it's been founded by you and will be upheld by you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.